Hey y'all, it's me, Cindy Fessler, your fellow Christian warrior, here to help you know more so you can share more and grow more of God's kingdom. So, if y'all haven't already done this, you know what to do. Please make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button so that more people can see this video. More Christians can know how to share their faith with others. Thanks so much. Another reason is they're rejected by the Protestant church because of the unbiblical teachings of these questionable books, such as praying for the dead, praying for the deceased, which is advocated in 2nd Maccabees, and it's in direct opposition to Luke 16:25 and 26 and Hebrews 9:27, among others. So the Apocrypha also contained the episode which has God assisting Judith in a lie. See Judith 9:10, which is an Apocrypha book. The Apocrypha contains demonstrable errors as well. Tobit, which is one of the Apocryphal books, was supposedly alive when Jehoram staged his revolt in 931 BC, and he was still living at the time of the Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. Yet the book of Tobit says he lived only 158 years. So there's contradictions in there that just aren't right. So the non-canonical Gospels appear too late. The Gospels found in the New Testament appeared very early in history. So the earlier they appeared, the more reliable they are. There's good reason to believe that Mark's Gospel was written as early as 50 years after the death of Christ, and that John's Gospel was written no later than 70 years after the death of Christ. These texts appeared early enough to be eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus, just as they claim to be. By comparison, the entire catalog of non-canonical Gospels were written much later in history. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, was written from 130 to 150 years after the death of Christ. The Gospel of Mary was written between 120 and 180 years after the death of Christ, and the Gospel of Judas from 130 to 170 years after the death of Christ. The non-canonical Gospels appear far too late to have been written by eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. The non-canonical Gospels were known to be fraudulent. The earliest disciples of Jesus and leaders of the church knew that these late-appearing Gospels were fraudulent. Early leaders like Polycarp, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Tertullian, and Epiphanius wrote about most of the non-canonical Gospels when they first appeared in history, identifying them as heretical frauds. Irenaeus, writing in 185 AD about the growing number of non-canonical texts, said that there were an indescribable number of secret and illegitimate writings, which they themselves have forged to bewilder the minds of foolish people who are ignorant to the true scriptures. Those who were closest to the action knew the late canonical texts were not to be trusted. The non-canonical Gospels reflect ulterior motives, and here's where the rubber meets the road, as I always say, guys. The authors of these non-canonical Gospels allow their theological presuppositions to corrupt their work. Many of the non-canonical texts, for example, were written by Gnostic authors utilizing the pseudonym of an apostle to legitimize the text. So they said that it was written by someone else. It was written by one of the apostles when they themselves really wrote it, and just put, a name of an apostle to it. So it's a total fraud, right? And they thought, well, this will legitimize it. Well, the text, while co-opting the person of Jesus to legitimize their theology. As a result, Jesus was often portrayed to be the source of hidden, esoteric wisdom communicated in sayings or dialogues with selected disciple who was privileged enough to be enlightened. In addition, Jesus was often described as a docetic, an immaterial spirit without a body, forcing the author to account for the appearances of a bodily death at the crucifixion or other physical appearances described in the New Testament. So they're just coming up with crazy stuff that didn't happen, basically. So the Apocrypha does not claim to be inspired by God, was not written by prophets of God, was not confirmed by supernatural acts of God, was not accepted by the people of God, and they were never included in the Hebrew Old Testament, does not always tell the truth of God, or like, for example, on praying for the dead or on working for salvation. Was not accepted by Jesus, the Son of God, was not accepted by the apostles who never quoted it, was not accepted by the early church, and was never included in the Protestant New Testament, was rejected by the great Catholic translator Jerome, was not written during a period of the prophets of God. They contain some absurdities and inconsistencies with the rest of the Bible canon. The Gnostic texts, these Gnostic Gospels and writings were written well into the second through the fourth centuries by authors who were not primary eyewitness and who falsely took the names of many of the apostles and disciples, such as the Gospel of Thomas, James, and Philip. There are over 300 of these writings. The Gnostic heretic Marcion, about AD 140. So they've got this heretic, this famous Gnostic guy, was the first to promote these Gnostic writings in the Christian community, but the early church leaders unanimously rejected them. Gnostic literature contained absurdities and inconsistencies. They do not reflect a first century Palestine Jesus. Gnostic writings have no basis in primary evidence, cross references to other scriptures, or confirmation from the first and second century churches, and the dating of the book is the key for recognizing legitimate literature. Gnostic contain false doctrines and heresies, Gnosticism, asceticism, Docetism, modalism. These are inconsistent with the doctrinal essentials of classical Christianity. The books of the Christian Bible today are the same ones used by the early disciples and followers of Christ, and therefore any other books out there would not be part of the classic Christian faith anyway. The pseudepigrapha. So first, these pseudepigrapha are not considered historically accurate. Many of these works claim to be written by people who appear in the Bible, but the best archaeological research and other studies find no evidence to back the authorship claims. It's traditionally believed that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, were written by Moses. The Testament of Moses is written many centuries after the Torah, and there's no historical evidence that Moses actually wrote it. So you've got this book called the Testament of Moses, and they say, well, this is something else that Moses wrote. No, it was written many centuries later. There's no historical evidence to show that Moses actually wrote this supposed Testament of Moses. He did write the Torah. He didn't write this oddball Testament of Moses. Similarly, the Testament of Solomon is a collection of folklore tales about Solomon, which includes stories like him using a magic ring to summon demons to build his temple. Similar points can be made about the Gnostic Gospels, which we talked about, which are supposedly written by the apostles and their circle, but there's no evidence that they were written by Peter or Thomas or any other writers who supposedly wrote them. The fact that the Gnostic Gospels have all been shown to have been written decades after the 4 canonical Gospels, the ones that we're familiar with, in periods when the original apostles and their associates were long dead, further shows how historically inaccurate they are. Second, these books don't teach the same thing as Scripture. Some of these books contain ideas that are similar to ideas found in Scripture. Some of them may even have bits of truth in them. The fact that Jude apparently quoted the book of Enoch and the book of Moses suggests that Jude found individual ideas in those books that had value. However, at some juncture, these books all diverge from biblical views. Many of them describe a Gnostic view of the world, which describes spiritual things and material things in a way that doesn't fit the biblical view of spirit and matter. Third, there's a line of verification from the Old Testament to the New Testament. The canonical books of the Old Testament were verified over and over by Jewish prophets and scholars. In the early church period, many churches didn't have a full collection of the New Testament, and some read books that are now considered part of the pseudepigrapha. However, as multiple apologists and biblical scholars have noted, when the New Testament was officially canonized at the Synod of Hippo at 393 AD, the leaders didn't look at the various books and selectively pick the ones they liked for the canon. In fact, there's a lot less debate about which books to include than you'd think. The later Gospels had been treated almost by everyone as false for centuries, and the same thing applied to the older pseudepigrapha books. Despite conspiracy theories used as big plot points in novels like the Da Vinci Code, there hasn't been much debate amongst qualified scholars throughout the centuries about whether the pseudepigrapha can be considered scripture. So let's talk about the methods of analysis. How did they decide what was to be included in the canon? Let's dig into the nitty-gritty of this. So this shows that none of the lost gospels were ever considered to be on par with the rest of scripture, and that there was no conspiracy to leave them out. So let's talk about this. What were the methods? It is important to understand the means by which scholars like Jesus Seminar examine the Gospels, both canonical and non-canonical. They assume that because Jesus's culture was an oral one and written records were secondary, any text must then be stripped down to their primary oral roots. This assumption occurs because these scholars were shaped by the prevailing dogma of literary criticism in the 1960s and 80s, which declared that all writing is secondary to its original oral form of communication, and that all written texts are therefore to be approached with suspicion. Accordingly, they maintain that the original teachings of Jesus must be meticulously reconstructed by sifting out from the written text only those words that probably were those spoken by Jesus. Evans explains that sometimes scholars are able to extract earlier sources from extant or existing text. For example, since Matthew and Luke contain so many similar sayings that do not appear in Mark, scholars believe they shared a common source, which they call Q. But Evans differentiates between this and what scholars such as the Jesus Seminar do when they reconstruct hypothetical texts. He says, writings such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter drip with indications of lateness. In other words, they came so much later. Yet some scholars, they just hope that these could be maybe included forms in their writings in the first century. They do this by attempting to extract early hypothetical forms of the text from the actual text that we have. But they do this without any evidence. So they hope so much that they want to include them that they kind of make up stuff. New Testament scholar Ben Witherington also criticizes this. Ben Witherington says the textual scholars are dealing with actual manuscripts and trying to reconstruct the original text from objective data. The Jesus Seminar, however, must engage in reconstruction before they could even consider the issue at hand. There's furthermore no truly objective evidence whatsoever for supposing that Thomas and Peter are early documents, or that in most all cases they preserve earlier traditions than does Mark. There is, however, the objective testimony of early church fathers such as Papias about the origins of Mark. However, critically, we must evaluate such testimonies. Such testimonies are nowhere found for Thomas or secret Mark or the Gospel of Peter or a variety of other documents on which Crossan and the Jesus Seminar rely on so heavily. So Meyer says it is only natural for scholars to say nothing of popularizers, to want more, to want others access roads to historical Jesus, and that this not always critical desire is what leads to such a high evaluation of extra-canonical writings. He adds, for better or for worse, in our quest for the historical Jesus, we are largely confined to the canonical Gospels, and to include other Gospels like Peter or Thomas with them is to broaden out our pool of sources from the difficult to the incredible. Well, hey guys, thanks so much for watching this video. I am so excited that you stuck to it to the end, and I appreciate that. And please do smack that subscribe button. Check out the next video.